Okay, look, what's the time now? It's just gone past. We'll probably wait just a very short while longer, maybe about another minute or so. There's supposed to be quite a few people registered, and I hope they all sort of join in before we begin. Thanks for introducing yourself, Larry. Okay, what's the time? Yeah, I think we'll make a start now. There you go. First of all, how many people do we have? 30. So there might be a few more people joining us as we proceed. But I'm sure Hannah and Dan have got a packed program today, so we'll probably make a start. So before we begin, we'd like to welcome you to this webinar by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we meet today. I know today that we have participants from different parts of Australia, New Zealand, even the United States, and possibly other places as well. So although we are meeting online, we are still physically on traditional lands. As we continue to walk in the first footprints of Aboriginal people, no matter where we are on this land, we recognize the important role that traditional elders have played in education, research, and knowledge creation. Thus, I would like to respectfully acknowledge all elders and officially welcome you to this session. Just very quick logistics before we begin. If you can, please keep your videos turned on, certainly during the main part of the presentation. It will certainly help the presenters focus a little bit better. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat on the sides. We may be able to turn on the microphone at the end, depending on how many people we have. But for now, you are unable to unmute yourself. We are recording this session, so we will be sharing our recording through the enablingeducators.org website. Our Twitter handle is at 01NAEEA, and the hashtag that we are using for all of our webinars is hashtag NAEEAWS. So if you are engaging with social media, please use our Twitter handle and or just the hashtag. If you want to find out more about National Association of Enabling Educators, please Google us, just NAEEA, and you'd be able to find more information about that. This webinar is hosted by the National Association of Enabling Educators of Australia, and the topic for today is COVID-19, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander student and teacher experiences. Today's topic is so important because quite often as educators, we tend to design our learning around a mainstream student and frequently neglect students from normally non-traditional backgrounds. As inexcusable as this is, often higher education institutions get away with this practice within a face-to-face setting. But in an online environment, we had to do, as we had to do with COVID-19, it becomes so much more important to address the learning needs of all students, particularly students from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. So today we are very lucky to have Hannah Pipe and Dan Collins from the University of Newcastle here with us to share their experiences. Hannah is an Indigenous Enabling Learning Advisor at University of Newcastle, and Dan is the acting convener of the PUG program at University of Newcastle. So I'll stop the share and I'll get Hannah to share her screen and take over. Thank you, Hannah.
Okay, thank you for that, Pranit, and welcome everybody. As Pranit said, today we're going to be touching on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander student and teacher experience through COVID-19. So my name is Hannah Pipe and I am a proud Nyamba woman from the outskirts of Brewarrina in northwestern New South Wales, and I'm currently working as the Indigenous Enabling Learning Advisor within the YAPUG program here at the University of Newcastle. Dan?
Yeah, so my name is Dan Collins. I'm a Biripi Warramai man from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and I'm the acting YAPUG program convener. So I look after all the programs within YAPUG, which is the Indigenous Enabling program that we run at Newcastle Uni.
So as we all know, 2020 has certainly been a year for new and, dare we say, unprecedented conditions in terms of the adaptations in the way in which we teach our enabling programs. For us as Indigenous educators of Indigenous enabling students, it has been particularly tricky. Typically, we as Aboriginal people and learners have a unique way in which we learn, known as the Aboriginal ways of being, knowing and doing. This way of learning relates specifically to an 8 ways framework, which describes and defines our ways of learning and creates links to Western ways of learning. This is the philosophy that we use to teach our students within the YAPUG Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Enabling Program here at the University of Newcastle. This framework allows all teachers and academics to include Aboriginal perspectives by using Aboriginal learning techniques. In this way, focus can remain on core curriculum content while embedding Aboriginal perspectives into every lesson. The framework consists of 8 interconnected pedagogies. Our pedagogies see teaching and learning as visual, kinesthetic, social, and highly contextualized. Adapting our way of educating and learning into an online environment, which we were all forced into during the peak of COVID-19, has been a steep learning curve for both us as educators and for our students. What we're doing here, oh, go on, Dan.
Sorry, so you can see the overall framework there with its 8 different sections shown by symbols. So we'll be talking about them in more detail. And there's a little couple of words to sort of just briefly introduce each one there. One of this way of actually showing the overview of what we're going to do and then breaking it up into chunks is actually one of the specific ways of learning called deconstruct reconstruct that we'll go into more detail about later.
Thanks for that, Dan. So the key components within our 8 ways are story sharing. So this is the key pedagogy in the 8 ways framework. It's the basis for most of our learning environments. We focus on story sharing as it's not only the way in which we keep up to date on current issues and topics, but it also creates cultural connection and safety in our learning environments. We connect the curriculum to storytelling and dreaming stories and explain how that relates back to our community and current contexts.
So it's got a symbol there of a killer boomerang, and you'll notice that it's an asymmetrical boomerang, so it's got a shorter side and a longer side. So that sort of represents that the story starts out with normal life, then it builds up to a climax, but at the end things calm down to normal, but it's never the same normal as what the original start of the story was. So that's just showing sort of the arc of a story and how things change.
Next, we have learning maps, and these are used to visualize pathways of knowledge. These are similar to what would be called a mind map in Western terms, where diagrams or visualizations are used to map out processes explicitly for the learners.
Yeah, so that symbol's showing like a learning path, and it's winding its way around key events that are happening in that learning path.
Next up, we've got non-verbal, and for us, learning is a hands-on experience, and the importance of body language and silence is highlighted. Knowledge can be tested by way of experience, reflection, and practice. In doing this, students often find that their critical thinking skills are better than what they initially thought, as Aboriginal people have been educating and learning using these same techniques since the beginning of time.
So that symbol, the hand there, shows that represents that things can be acquired without just using words, but it's got more in it than that. It also shows that there can be revealed knowledge through things like insight or dreams or reflection afterwards.
Then we move on to symbols and images. These relate to the understanding of concepts and content. Knowledge is linked to symbols and images and becomes an effective tool for learning and memorizing complex knowledges.
So that symbol there is a symbol of a yarning circle. So you've got 5 people gathered in a circle. And it's a really good example of how just through a simple symbol like that, you can actually encompass a huge amount of information and meaning. So that symbol represents all the connections between the people and the way that the knowledge moves in between people.
We move on then to land links. For Aboriginal people, learning is about linking content to local land and place and changes dramatically from person to person. It is imperative to be able to create connection between the content and land, place and context for each learner to be able to foster a concrete understanding.
So it's got a symbol of a river there. A river's a great symbol because it shows that there's connections between, it's got the fish as the animal, the plants, but it's also land and sea, the interface between the two, because country doesn't just mean the actual land, it means the water and the air as well.
Then we go on to non-linear. So Aboriginal learning is a continuous journey. Problems are solved through association and making connection to existing knowledges. There is constant process of reflection and relating new knowledges to existing knowledges within the learning environment.
So this symbol, the concentric circles there represent one point of the knowledge, but it's branching off to other pieces of knowledge, and it's not straight to represent the fact that sometimes knowledge can be not quite where you expect it to be, or you can bring in things that you don't think are connected, but there actually is a real connection there that can be brought in to help people to understand things.
We move on then to deconstruct, reconstruct, which Dan mentioned earlier. And this sees an overall meaning, purpose, and structure being given first, and then it being broken down into more manageable chunks. Learners are shown the final product, and then the process of how to do it is modelled by the teacher to the learners, who are then able to attempt the task.
Yeah, so we see this this method is probably in traditional teaching sort of methodology is all about scaffolding and breaking things down, but it's important to see that overall product first. The symbol represents a Torres Strait Islander drum, and it's showing that there's the shape shows there's a balance between independence and support. So in terms of when you're breaking things down, explaining them, scaffolding them, there's got to be a balance between the independence of the learner, but then the support provided by the educator.
And our final is community links. So learning is group orientated and connected to real life purposes and contexts. Learners need to be able to see real life implications for why they are learning specific content and how this relates back to their specific communities.
Yeah, so this symbol shows knowledge spiraling out from a local level to encompass areas around that local level, but then in the end, everything's going to feed back into the community in the end.
Our 8 ways encompass what is known as the Aboriginal ways of being, knowing and doing. Our ways are tied to our worldviews, which are very different to Western ways. Pre-COVID-19, our teaching practices were solely face-to-face, hands-on and heavily practical. And because of this, these ways of being, knowing and doing translated seamlessly into our academic learning environments. Online, however, we lose that contact and connection, which was so important for our people, and it was this that we had to try and overcome. When we realised that we were going to be put into an online environment, our first and immediate action was to find out what access our students had. We found that some had no personal computers or laptops. Some had no internet at home and had to go and hotspot from local car parks with free Wi-Fi access. And some, due to relocating back home to remote communities, simply had no access at all. To try and ensure appropriate access for our students, lone laptops and wireless dongles were made available for those that needed them. For those that were adverse to moving online for whatever reason, hard copies of the semester's work were printed out and express posted to them at no expense to the student.
Yeah, so as part of the YPUG enabling program, we have students who come from a really, really diverse background. We have students that when they start the program might only be 17 years of age, and there's no age ceiling cut. So there can be students who are still teenagers and could even still be in high school, to students who may have completed high school 30, 40 years ago. We also have a large range in the students' knowledge about technology and how to use it. And we draw students from hundreds of kilometres around, from areas that some might actually live in Newcastle, but some could come from small communities that are hundreds of kilometres away. So we really had to address those needs, those diverse needs of all those students as quickly as we could.
Lectures and tutorials were all done live so that students were able to yarn and interact virtually with their teacher. We chose to do a live delivery rather than a pre-recorded to try and give students that face-to-face experience that they had initially. In doing this, it was found that engagement and interaction was maintained. Content, however, did need to be broken down into extremely explicit information chunks for delivery to avoid confusion for students. It was also difficult for students to maintain engagement in the learning activities without the regular social release, which would normally occur in the form of that natural back and forth conversation and discussion. The live delivery, though, acted by a way of a virtual check-in for students and staff in both an academic sense, but also a well-being sense for the students.
Yeah, so the university sort of offered us two different ways we could go. We could have chosen to do an asynchronous delivery where we recorded the lectures basically and the tutorials even to some degree, I guess, although that would have been more difficult. Pre-recorded them and just students could access them whenever we wanted to. But we went with that live delivery for the reasons Hannah outlined. They were still all recorded though as well. So students had stuff going on in the background that meant they couldn't engage with the live class. They could still access the recorded version. And as Hannah said, it was, I mean, probably the most difficult thing was not having that comfortable, easy back and forth to really be able to address any sort of learning difficulties that students were having. That was probably the thing that I found the most difficult. It just makes it clunky. So that you don't know, you can't talk over the top of people and you're waiting for someone to say stuff. So that was probably the thing that personally I found most difficult in delivering it. It's just that natural back and forth just sort of disappeared. And I think the students really felt that.
So students were called weekly by the Indigenous Enabling Learning Advisor as a further check-in for them. These individual calls offered students more time to discuss anything that they needed to, and also allowed for a more personal support session to take place. Students were able to highlight if they would like weekly or fortnightly check-ins. Most of them opted for a weekly check-in just for a general catch-up. All student contact was documented within a workbook that the program convener had direct access to for ease of communication between staff on student progress and their wellbeing. The focus for online delivery was purely about maximum availability and ease of access of support and academic staff for students. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students need to feel a connection to their learning environment in order to make meaning from it. And it was thought that by being as available as possible, that we could create this connection for them. Some students won't seek help on their own. So in continually reaching out, we were hopeful to try and preempt the need for this support. This personal connection and really knowing our students allowed us to make informed decisions about whether we might need to grant extra time or offer incomplete grades for any work that might be outstanding. And this further reduced potential stress and anxiety for our students.
Yeah, so one of the strengths of the PUG program, I think, is that it's a purely face-to-face model normally, and most of the classes are timetabled around the Birrabahn building that Wallatuka operates out of, so that students they're around all the time. So just in every day at work, you're running into the students, and it's not hard to check in on them. but as soon as COVID hit, that went out the window. So Hannah started up these support calls. I think it was a really effective method of trying to stay connected to the students. Overall, the students who, the funny thing was, not funny, the thing was that the students that were going to be successful anyway were still very successful. The ones that didn't have issues with the academic content and self-motivation and engagement, they were all fine. In fact, they maybe even went better than they would normally go. But it was the students that really need that little kick along and a bit of personal encouragement. They were the ones that we started to see that weren't doing as well as maybe they could have. So that check-in was our attempt to try to mirror that. I think it was quite successful. I don't think there's any way you could make it quite as successful as that face-to-face constant check-in that we normally get. But I think it went pretty close.
Yeah, I agree. So during our first week back in our face-to-face settings, after restrictions had eased, a yarning circle was held, which is the normal process for all of our classes. Discussions focused around the student experience through online learning and how they were feeling post-COVID-19 isolation, and if they felt like they were still on track with their studies. The yarning circle was opened by a statement from the course coordinator about how proud the students should be within themselves in regards to pushing through and achieving the amazing results that they did. So just for context, our retention between semester 1 and semester 2 was pretty much the same as it normally would have been in any other year. So they did really, really well. During this conversation in the yarning circle, the course coordinator was immediately met with a reply from a student that you can see on the screen now. And he said that all we did was be students. It's you guys that did all the hard work, reaching out every week and how available you all were. I've never felt so supported, and I thank you for that. And this was a similar sentiment that was echoed throughout the rest of the yarning circle, which I think is really positive feedback.
Hannah, do you want to just quickly outline to everyone what a yarning circle is in case they don't know and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So in pretty much all of our classes within YPUG, we commence each session with a yarning circle. So a yarning circle is a safe space for the participants to communicate, whatever it is they're discussing that week. So for us in our classes, it's usually based on their well-being initially, how they're feeling, moving through the course, if they've got external factors influencing them, and those sorts of things, and then how they're feeling within their academic life as well. No person's voice is more important than anyone else's, and they sort of take it in turn. So if someone says something that you connect with during your yarning circle, that's when it's your time to speak up next. And yeah, we host them every week in our classrooms.
So it's got a bit of a check-in sort of an aspect to it, and so that students can start to build those relationships up and we can get some informal feedback. And it's arranged, all the students sit in a circle. So like Hannah said, everyone's on an equal footing.
So success for students is a very varied thing. Success for enabling students is even more so. And it's really important not to force perceived measures of success onto any one student, and they all have their own individual journey. overall, the feedback from our current student cohort is that success for them now is that they made it through. They signed on for a face-to-face, very intensely supported enabling program and ended up experiencing a program that, while it was still supportive, pushed them into a learning environment that they weren't necessarily expecting. But with their own grit and determination, they made it through to the other side and are continuing to reach their journeys.
Yeah, and I've had a few discussions with students who have gotten a bit downhearted about the fact that they haven't been quite as successful as they wanted to be. But I've tried to point out to them that passing any of their units at the moment is basically a success. Even staying engaged with the program. I mean, even if they've failed everything, but they're still engaged and they're still trying, then that's really a success. And the head of Wallatuka, Kathy Butler, said a really interesting thing to me, which I took to heart a couple of months ago, when she said that the success of an enabling program, it's also not just about the individual that's doing the program at the time. That individual may not end up completing the program or taking it any further. But if they have a positive experience and they felt comfortable in that, then there's a high likelihood that other members of their family, because they could have been the first person to ever have a tertiary education experience, if they pass on positive feedback and encourage another member of their family to come in and they're eventually successful, then that first student's experience is really a success, even though they didn't complete. So I think we really need to, it's important to look at the whole picture of success and long-term, what that really means.
So this further reiterated the notion that we initially had about the need for support and availability of staff for Indigenous students. University is a Western concept and is often overwhelming enough for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. It's not a place where our mob naturally feel comfortable and at ease. To start to create that connection and bond, and then force students into an even more foreign environment, such as the online space, enabled us to further develop our own practices and understandings of the ways in which we can effectively educate and engage with our students. The experience has also shown that it is possible to run effective online programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander enabling students with our pedagogies embedded throughout, which is something that had not previously been done within our program.
Yeah, and Hannah and I were having a discussion with a colleague of ours a couple of months ago about how he was going to, how they were going to rework their early entry scheme that was usually face-to-face. And he said something to us again that really connected with me, was that that all of this stuff around COVID-19, and I've heard it mirrored in things that other people have said, it's really an opportunity to try out things that normally you might have been a bit scared to try out. But in this environment, it's almost like we've been given a free pass to try things, because we have to try things that are new anyway. And if they don't work, well, it's not the end of the world. We can take something from it. So we were able to take this positive from it. I think it also made us aware of a lot of that, even though, I mean, we can run things in an online environment and still have success, but it also brought to the fore some of the problems that we would still need to solve. I think there's still issues around engagement and retention that became obvious to us that would still need possibly extra support, some refining of the things that we did, just to really try and keep those students engaged and keep moving through the program.
Yeah. And that brings us to the end of our little spiel for now. I believe, we have some questions and answers that we'd like to get to.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Hannah and Dan. That was pretty good. I've just been taking note of some of the questions that were coming up in the chat, for example. I think Susie was interested in trying to get a little bit more understanding about how you develop the yarning circles in an online environment.
So Dan, did you want to take that or you want me to?
No, you take that one.
Yeah, sure. So because we were online, we were conducting our yarning circles over Zoom. So much like we are today, everyone is visible and you can still converse and maintain that conversation and contact. So it was all about being just respectful of people when they talk, and just for ease and flow of conversation, I used to get students to pop their hand up when they felt connected to something, and then they would move on from there.
Yeah, and one of the important things about our program is the journey that the students go on and the connections they make, and they bond really closely as a cohort, and that was certainly something we tried to encourage online. But I think, I don't know if you could ever reproduce it in an online environment as easily. I think it's just a bit harder for students to really, especially to start those relationships, I think would be quite difficult. We're probably lucky in a way that we had those first 4 or 5 weeks of semester 1, where the students did all get to know each other. I think that would have been much more difficult if we had have started from scratch with the students not having met each other at all in person. I think that would certainly put in an additional hurdle that you'd have to try to overcome.
And just related to that particular question, another one, if I could sort of pop one in, please. In terms of the topics that you were covering in those yarning circles, was it structured in terms of, or could the students talk about whatever they felt like?
Yeah, they speak about whatever they felt like talking about. We'd usually start with just the initial content that we'd covered that week, just for the first probably 5 minutes or so, and then it was just about sharing, whatever was on their mind.
Yeah, and it can often go. I mean, discussions in general in our classrooms can often go off on all sorts of tangents, which is good because it allows us to follow that 8 ways framework, whereby we've got the non-linear aspect, where they'll bring up certain things, but then we can sort of link them back into the topic and make links that way. And it also really encourages that story narrative aspect of the learning framework to come through.
Very good, actually, very interesting. Now, because we don't have too many people online, I've enabled you to unmute yourself. So if you would like to ask any questions or comments, you should be able to unmute yourself. But just to keep things orderly, perhaps you can just sort of indicate that you are interested in putting a question in. I think Susie was interested in asking a question. Is that right, Susan?
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry I don't have my video on, but my camera's not working for some reason. I really love your model, and you know, I can really see how we can perhaps lift our game up a little bit more and make it a bit more explicit, you know, in our, especially in our online tutorials and our study guide materials. So I have two questions for you. One about the symbols. You know, would that be culturally disrespectful to use those symbols in, you know, when we're doing some kind of activity that is related to those kind of symbols? Is that possible or not? Would that not be appropriate?
I can answer this, I guess. The 8 Ways framework is probably around 10 years old now, roughly, and it's been. I come from a high school teaching background originally, and I know that within the Department of Education New South Wales, the 8 Ways framework is widely used, and teachers within that use the symbols freely to, I guess they use, so they can identify how they're using the different 8 Ways pedagogies within their programs. So yeah. I think it's so widely used that if you wanted to use it would be okay. All, yeah, I'd go for it.
Yeah, okay. And I just wondered if you had some specific examples, you know, from each of those 8 ways in the online environment, if you could share like a couple. I mean, I suppose stories is fairly obvious, but and the breaking it down into manageable chunks is another obvious one that we do.
Well, one way that I found the stories could be quite effective that I hadn't actually really thought of before was when students were giving presentations, I really encouraged them to include stories within their presentations as well, to try and put more of a personal spin on it and make the presentation more engaging for their audience. So that was one thing that I did a little bit differently. Probably around the deconstruct, reconstruct one, if I could add something more on that, is I think the explicit instruction can be really, really important for enabling students, and it can be very easy to assume that they know certain things and just gloss over them because it's so second nature to us as educators. They really need that explicit broken down instruction. And Hannah talked about that when she talked about really being aware all the time of having to really chunk down instructions into little manageable sizes so that students could take it on and act it out. There were a few times where I gave some general instructions and said, off you go. And the students just had no idea. Yeah. So I think
have the same thing. And we actually we asked for a couple of volunteers to actually tell us what the instructions are so that they can hear it in their own voice. And that seems to help a bit, you know, because sometimes when you hear it in their own kind of language or in the way they speak, it helps. So
yeah, and especially when we were using breakout rooms a lot in tutorials, and I was finding that I was giving an instruction to them all, then they'd go into their breakout rooms, and then as I'd go through the breakout rooms to check on their progress, I'd basically have to re-explain the whole thing again. So as the semester got on, I was much more aware of that all the time, and just keeping it in the back of my mind and being really, really careful about breaking things down properly.
Very good, excellent. Adam has put something in the chat about, I believe some coastal communities express the 8 ways is not relevant to the specific context. Can it still be, it can still be a useful framework? I think just add on to that, I mean, is the 8 ways framework transferable across countries at all, or is it specific to a particular geographical location?
I can answer that one. So the beauty of the 8 Ways learning framework is that it's not tied to specific content. It's a teaching strategy. So it can be used with any content. And I guess certainly there are different elements of it that lend themselves more easily or naturally to certain types of content. But it's definitely non-content specific. I think by using or trying to use as many of the different ways as you can, you're going to be able to engage with learners that learn in different ways. So that's a really helpful thing. And I know that they have aligned it to what's called the quality teaching model, which was a more academic Western type model that came out of, I'm pretty sure it came out of Newcastle University about probably 15 years ago, out of the education faculty there. And it actually aligns really closely with all the different elements of that. So I think, yeah, people should look at using whatever bits of it they want, wherever they want. Yeah.
It's something that can be fluid and contextualized to meet, you know, whatever environment that you're teaching into.
Okay, that's fantastic. It's pretty good. Now, anybody else has any other questions or comments? Is there anything coming in the chat? Let me just have a look.
Kerry Bond here.
Yep.
I have something. I'm just curious if you have any suggestions on how to actually reach students who are in community, because I think that's a more difficult group of students to access, particularly those who really don't feel comfortable leaving community. You know, if they're really attached to country, to come into an urban area to go to university is a pretty massive thing. So have you got any studies to, I suppose, suggestions on how universities can actually reach out in the first place and then maintain that support when they may not have access to Wi-Fi? I know you've said you call them, you could call them or hand out, you know, hard copies of things, but how do you actually recruit and then maintain that in a long-term sort of situation? Have you got any suggestions? So that was long.
Well, I know in previous years, we've actually gone out to community in terms of recruitment of students and engage with them individually in their locations, just to try and develop that relationship initially. In terms of maintaining contact long-term, in students who are staying in community and not coming onto campus, that's not a bridge that we have broached within our enabling program yet, because we are solely face-to-face. Dan, do you have any suggestions for what you think we could do?
Yeah, I do. I can see Anna Bennett in the audience there, waving. Hi, Anna. So we're actually in the process of looking at a model where we can move on country and deliver an enabling program outside of a university context. And I guess the most important thing with starting off a process like that, and we're only at the start of it, is really extensive consultation with the community. So that's what we're doing at the moment. Just to really get a clear idea about what the community want, what their expectations are, and so that they can have their voice heard, so that we can give them information. But I think it's probably actually more important than just us giving them information about what we can deliver, is allowing them to have their voice heard, so we can take that on board and they feel that the whole community or a majority of the community is really involved in the whole process, and so that they have buy-in into it. Another thing I'd just add to what Hannah said before, we really encourage students to come in. The students that come from remote areas, we encourage them to come into the building and meet with us before the university semester starts, and before we even have little orientation events and things like that. They encourage their parents to come in as well and meet with us if they want, or their other family members, just to make them feel really comfortable in that physical environment, and to start to build up some relationships with the staff members and possibly even other students that are around before the semester kicks off.
Thanks very much. That's good.
Sorry, Dan, did you say before orientation or during orientation?
Yeah, so I mean, Hannah's been talking to students that are potential students for next year even.
Yeah.
So we encourage them to come in as soon as possible, basically. Sort of strike while the iron's hot and while they're keen, and really try to make them feel just comfortable in that physical space, so that they're familiar with it, so that they know people, and it just removes some of the roadblocks to them engaging with us later.
Thank
exactly.
you.
Okay, anybody else has got any questions? I had a question in the chat early on, and that was related to your synchronous online sessions that you were hosting. What was the attendance like in those synchronous sessions, in terms of a lot of people were turning up, or most people were not turning up, or what was the attendance like?
So I teach into the core program within UPUG, and I was having roughly 17 of 23 people show up each week.
That's
so attendance was really good, and they were really engaged. Those that didn't show up to class received a phone call after class just to see what was happening, if anything was going on, and they also had access to the class as it was recorded and posted for them to be able to view later on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I probably had about 50% roughly sort of attendance at mine, which is lower than you'd get generally in a face-to-face situation. But a lot of the time the students would email me in advance and let me know they weren't going to be able to attend, or I'd follow it up and encourage them if they weren't attending in that live session. They can look at the lecture material pretty well, but I think they really miss out on a lot of that follow-up of the tutorial, which really helps to cement a lot of the stuff you cover within the lecture, and they just don't delve into it deeply enough that their learning is going to be really substantial.
Excellent. Okay. Maybe we have time for a last quick one, if anybody's got a quick question or comment at the end. Okay. If not, well, thank you very much, Hannah and Dan. I think that was it was a really a great presentation. I certainly enjoyed it, and I'm pretty confident that most people online here would have enjoyed it as well. I think, Victoria, did you have a...
Sorry,
go for it.
I do have one. So I think it's really interesting how you said the synchronous learning was really important. I teach tertiary prep, and I also mostly teach English as an additional language. And in the English language courses, it's absolutely 100% synchronous classes. And I think that interaction is really important, as you were saying, for so many reasons. And a few students can't attend, and we do record and they can watch that. But I'm just interested because in our tertiary prep program, they tend not to record those classes, and I just wonder what your feelings about that would be. I mean, do you think they're a good do you think it's important to make those available, especially for Indigenous students, so there is that kind of informal learning element, even if they're just watching it later?
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to offer both modes. So, you know, we don't know what's going on in our students' life at the time of our class, especially those that have gone back home. So by enabling them to be able to access it at a time that is more convenient for them was really important for us. Those that also access later on were also offered the option of having a phone call with myself as a learning advisor while they watched it, so they could ask me questions during that time.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I guess I was concerned a little bit that by almost by making it so easy to access asynchronously, I almost felt in myself that it was almost encouraging the students to not have to be there. But I think it's just so important to try to keep, where possible, try to keep some structure into their lives and some regular sort of scheduling. Otherwise, things can just sort of drift into nothingness. But also really important to try to still allow that access to students that had other things. We had students that have like school-age children, for instance, and when school shut, they were at home trying to look after their children, so they couldn't just sit in the lecture at the normal time and access it. They were doing it later on at night and things like that. So just trying to strike that best balance.
Is it, I guess my other question is it important in for Indigenous students to be able to have that not just written material, because I know that some of our tertiary prep written material, I look at the interface and my head kind of explodes, because it's too much. It's way too much stuff, and it's hard to find stuff, and it makes me anxious. So I'm sure it makes a lot of students anxious. So is it important also to have that, you know, the spoken, the videos, as well as written material, especially for that self-access modules that often take place?
Yeah, I would say yes, it's important for them to have some sort of visual. It goes by way of bridging that connection that we would usually have in our normal learning environments. I mean, they get to see a face, and it's as close as we can get virtually to sitting in a room with them.
Yeah, and it just breaks it up a bit too. It breaks it up a bit, and we even found that sort of across the whole uni that the students couldn't engage for the normal lengths of times in which they would. And I think it also relates back to what Hannah was saying about having those little social releases that we normally have in class that don't really happen. They can happen a bit over a Zoom, but you don't get that natural interaction between people, and those little humorous events or things like that just let off a little bit of steam and help people to stay focused. So I think the breaking up the information into different varied forms just allows you to alleviate that issue.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Anna.
I really like your theme of sort of variability and diversity. Diversity in learning, that all learning is different. and success. I think that's so important. You know, your points there, they were amazing. And then, you know, in terms of engagement, not having walls of text and having lots of variability. So I think that theme is really fantastic, and it's just great to hear.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Jenny, you had your hand up a little bit early on. Did you have something to add? We probably don't have too much time. Yeah. Jenny, are you still there? Doesn't look like it.
Yeah,
she was and
I think somebody asked if you do the yarning circle online on Zoom. Did you answer that one?
Yeah, we do still do them. We did them online, just sort of as we are doing now.
Jenny said she put a question in the chat. How did First Nation students fare more generally across the uni during this time? Okay, so I can answer that. Because in my previous role as a student advancement coordinator, we actually rolled out a whole, I guess, sort of an ongoing program of checking calls, probably even more formal, in a more formal way than what Hannah did, because it was run by about four student advancement officers, and it had to be a little bit more formal because it couldn't really be guaranteed who was going to be calling them the next time. So we basically had a survey that was recorded within one of our systems, and we had a series of questions, so sort of a script that they loosely followed, and they would input information about the different questions, and that just allowed us to see what the levels of engagement were like, and the problems that students were having, and then they could indicate whether they wanted follow-up calls and things like that, and how often, and if they didn't want to be called, we could say, well, if you need help, you know where to find us. And we scheduled them probably about once every 2 or 3 weeks. We'd roll through. We did all the commencing students that weren't enabling at first, and then we went on and did all the non-commencing students, and we just kept on alternating between that as it went. So I think overall they did pretty well. I think we're starting to see a little bit of the fallout of it across the university as a whole now, where our numbers sort of held up and held up and held up, but they are starting to fall a little bit now. I think it's just, I think the length of the pandemic sort of is starting to take its toll on people a bit. So that if it had have only been for, 2 months or something, I think people would have bounced back a bit. But I think, unfortunately, now we are starting to see that it is taking its toll. It's just an added. All students have issues in their life that come up, but when you add a blanket issue like this across the whole lot of them, sometimes it can just be the straw that breaks the camel's back, I guess, unfortunately. But for all those students that haven't continued to engage, as much as possible, we've let them know that, they can always come back next year and have another go. Or when things return to normal, they can always come back, and they shouldn't see the fact that they didn't complete this time as any sort of shame or, bad reflection on themselves, because we're living in extraordinary times.
Okay, look, I think we probably have to wrap it up there, guys. Thank you so much. I know we've got the absolute hardcore left now. We have gone over time, so thank you for Hannah and Dan for hanging around and taking these other questions at the end. Personally, I really enjoyed the presentation, and I'm sure everybody who attended enjoyed it as well. As I mentioned earlier on, we will be sharing the recording via the National Association of Enabling Educators website, probably sometime early next week. And if you're interested in finding more about the enabling educators in Australia, just Google NAEEA and you'll get to our website. And that'll be it. Thank you very much. And I'll see you all later. Just stop.
Thank you.